Lord, I thank you so much for this day and for time together and to get into your word. I pray, Lord, that you would just speak through Mike today, that you'd open our eyes and our hearts into the words you want us to hear, Lord, about you, and just that we would learn more about who you are. And we pray this all in Jesus' name.
Amen. All right, so I promised I'd bring books last week. I did this week, finally. So, good books to have. So this first one is by Andrew Hill and John Walton. It's a survey of the Old Testament. This one, so John Walton was my Genesis professor when I was at Moody. He's a good scholar. These books are good to have, whether it's this one or it's one similar to this, because it's just a survey book of every book in the Old Testament. So it gives you a very short, it's shorter than a full-on commentary, but tells you the basics. Who wrote it, about when was it written, who was it written to, what's a general overview, what are some key points, and then it kind of moves on from there. So these are good books to have in order to establish like a context and to maybe get some like very basic, what are the standard views, like if, when we look at like what does high scholarship have to say about Isaiah, this might tell you that, hey, general consensus is that there's not one Isaiah, there's like 3 Isaiahs, and there's like 6 different viewpoints on the authorship of Genesis and stuff like that, but it's not going to go into complete depth on all those things, but it's going to at least let you know what the viewpoints are. So I'll pass them around and take a look at it. Next 2 books, both written by the same author. This is by Oswald T. Allis. Kind of the same deal, except that this is only for the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books. All of Moses' books. Oswald Allis was, if you remember last week on the slideshow, there was the picture of the 5 old-timey looking guys sitting in the chairs. He was one of them. He was a professor at Princeton Seminary. He was a really, really good Old Testament scholar. So he's got these books, and then this is basically the same thing, which is that it's going to give you an overview of each one of the books, why it was written, and these are fairly dated now. These are probably written in like the 1930s or something like that. What's this one say? 1943. So they're a little bit dated, but still good and a little bit more pastoral, a little bit more sermonic. They're going to have some more teaching and kind of pastoral viewpoint. This one's interesting because this is Michelangelo's Moses, and if you notice on the top of his head, he's got horns, because there was, in the Latin Vulgate, there's disagreement as to whether it was just interpreted wrong or he did it on purpose, but Jerome, the person who translated the Latin Vulgate, in the passage that says that Moses came down from Mount Sinai and his face shone, in the Hebrew that means that he had horns, but it just means that
with King James or Luther.
It was in the King James too.
King James
Yeah. So one of the depictions that you'll see of Moses is that he had actual horns, but it really just meant that there were radiant beams of light coming from his head. But those are a couple other good books too, and survey books, like I said, they're kind of a step back from like a full commentary, which is going to give you in-depth looks at particular books or particular passages. These are going to be more of the survey type to kind of give you a quick overview and understanding of whatever the book is talking about. So like with that one, there are New Testament survey books, obviously, that are going to do the exact same thing. Okay, on to the actual material. So Genesis, purpose, authorship, and structure, not in that order whatsoever. All right, so the English name comes from the Latin Vulgate, incipit liber Bereshit id est Genesis. This is the book of Genesis, beginnings, which is a transliteration from the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is Genesis or Genesis. So it comes from the Latin Vulgate, which is a transliteration.
The transliteration.
Transliteration. So a transliteration as opposed to a translation. Translation, Genesis would just mean beginning. But transliteration would mean that the Greek word is Genesis, and they just took that and put that into Latin letters, Genesis. So if you were to get a transliteration of the Greek New Testament, it's just going to put the Greek letters into English letters, but it's not going to actually translate it, right? So that's the difference between a transliteration and a translation. The Hebrew name for the book is Bereshit, which is the first word of Genesis in the Masoretic text, in the beginning. So the Masoretic text is our generally accepted Hebrew version of the Old Testament. It comes from about 800 or 900 A.D. It's very late, but that's the accepted Hebrew text that we have. All right, composite. So there's Moses again, this time without horns. He's got beams of light coming from his head. So how did the text come to be? So one of the things that makes Genesis interesting and worth studying is that there's usually a very simple explanation for everything, and the simple explanation always has problems with it. And so the simplest explanation for how did Genesis come to be is that Moses wrote it entirely all at one time. Nothing was ever added or taken out of it. And somehow he was given, how did he know all this stuff about things that happened before him? God told him. And I've heard that many, many, many times. And it's possible, not probable. So with Genesis, it's just not as simple as somebody wrote it. Who wrote it? You can ask that question. How many people wrote it? We can also ask that question. Where did they get their information? And I thought I had a fourth one, but there is not. Okay. Where did they get their information? So the reason that we would ask those questions is that there are problems with this. We have some difficulties we have to overcome. Anachronisms. So obviously Genesis is, whoever wrote it is writing about things that happened before them. But there are things that are said about the times before them that contain thoughts that could have only come from later in time. To this day, that happens a lot. To whose day? To Moses' day? How about to Ezra or Nehemiah's day? Because they found the Bible amongst the temple documents. Were things added to them? We don't know. We have no idea. Or possibly most scholars think that Genesis, in its final form, was probably a post-exilic formulation. So there was a Genesis that was written during the time of Moses, but in its final form, somehow people had added to it after the exile at some point. And so things like to this day could be 700, 600, 500 AD. We don't know. The city of Dan. So what would be the problem with the city of Dan showing up in Genesis, and in particular Genesis 14? This would have been during Abraham's time. What would be a problem with that?
The tribe of Israel would have been later.
Right. And what would be the problem with not just it popping up during Abraham's time, but if we presuppose that Moses was the last fingers on the book of Genesis, what's the problem with city of Dan during Moses' time?
Didn't exist.
Because?
There was no Dan.
No, there was Dan.
Oh, there was.
Yeah, because Israel was around during Moses' time, and the tribes had been divided up during Moses' time. But why would the city of Dan be a problem? Where was Moses writing from? Where was Moses not writing from?
Dan?
Well, you're not wrong.
I don't know, tell us.
The Promised Land. He never got into Israel, right?
True. Right, yeah.
So if he never got into Israel, then Dan could not have existed during Moses' time. So then the only possibility is that whoever, like that, the city of Dan may have existed, just not as Dan, right? So whoever wrote that passage or changed the passage possibly had to have come from a point after the city was known as the city of Dan. It could have had a different name prior to that. Either way, though, this is something that had to have come after Moses. Ur of the Chaldeans. Chaldeans didn't exist during the time of Abraham. So therefore, if they didn't exist during the time of Abraham, then how did Abraham come from a city where they came from also? Couldn't have happened. So it had to have been written later. So things like that too. Now, is it possible that Moses knew about the Chaldeans? Yes. But what it also tells us, because the Chaldeans were around when Moses was around, because if we remember when Moses went and saw Pharaoh and he was doing the miracles before Pharaoh, Pharaoh had Chaldeans with him that were able to mimic the, turning a steak into a stick or into a snake, things like that. They were able to mimic Moses' miracles. But the Chaldeans weren't around during the time of Abraham, so that tells us that Moses was not just simply taking documents that he had at his disposal and just putting them together. Because if a document existed that was written during the time of Abraham, would not have had the Chaldeans written in it. Do you understand what I'm getting at? Okay. Let me know if I get too wordy. Sometimes I start explaining things and I halfway through realize that my explanations are making things more convoluted. The Philistines. By all historical accounts that we know, the Philistines did not exist at this time. So now it's possible that they could have existed as a people group and just weren't known as the Philistines at that time. But we know roughly when the Sea Peoples, which the Philistines are one of the tribes of the Sea Peoples. There are, I think, 5 or 7 tribes of Sea Peoples. And we know roughly when they came because we have historical documents like Pharaoh Ramses II wrote about his wars against the Sea Peoples and how he subjugated them. And then we also know roughly from the Bible when did they start showing up. For the Philistines to be in Genesis, this just seems to be way too far ahead of when they started popping up. So where did they come from? So these are just like general problems as far as anachronisms go. Things that should be showing up later in time but are being treated as if these were a thing during the time that it was being written. There's also problems. Some of these problems are quote-unquote problems. They're not really problems, but they're seen as problems. Duplicates. So why is it that in Genesis 1 through 2-3 we have one creation story, and then in Genesis 2 we have another creation story? And in some places they seem to kind of contradict each other. Were animals created first, or was man created first? In Genesis 1, it's the animals. In Genesis 2, it's man. Which one is it? And then along the same lines, names of God. Why are you all of a sudden not? Oh, come on. And the names of God. So, again, quote-unquote problems. I don't see these as problems. Some people see these as problems. We have name of God is Elohim in first chapter through 2-3, and Yahweh Elohim in 2-4 through the end of second chapter. Why is God referred to as one consistent name in the first chapter and another consistent name in the second chapter? Does that show us that these were two separate documents that got glued together by two separate authors? That's been proposed. So that leads us to the first proposed answer to how did Genesis come to be, which is redaction criticism / documentary hypothesis. So that would be letter C there. Redaction criticism or documentary hypothesis.
Some light words for breakfast.
Exactly. That's why I made you write them down, because you're not going to remember them otherwise.
Do they mean all the same?
No, they're two different things. So a documentary hypothesis is a type of redaction criticism. So redaction criticism says that essentially, and this can be applied to multiple books of the Bible, could be the entire Old Testament, could be the New Testament, could be just the Gospels. But it essentially says that we have a document or group of documents that was put together by a series of editors. So redaction criticism in the Gospels says that there was a document called Q that doesn't exist now, and we don't have it, but when we look at the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we can see similarities between them where they're all saying the exact same thing, and therefore that means that they must be referring back to the singular document. And they've picked and chosen from that document that doesn't exist again, and they've put each one of the authors has put things together as they see fit. And with Luke, usually it goes back to Q, and he's taken Mark and added to it, and possibly gotten some help from Peter and added to it on top of it. There's all different kinds of theories about everything. With Genesis in particular, we have what's called the documentary hypothesis. So this is German in origin, and it tries to make sense of the composition of the Pentateuch given the previously listed problems. Sees the Pentateuch as a compilation of various sources pieced together by redactors. Now, redactor is just a fancy word for an editor. So it could be somebody that, so there's usually 4 of them, but it could be someone who has a document that was the first iteration of Genesis, and they came in and they said, I'm going to add this here and I'm going to add this here. Or it could be somebody that had the first iteration of Genesis and said, well, I've got this other document. This seems to go right in here, and just kind of stuck everything together. Depends on which higher critic you're talking about. You're going to get a different answer from every single one of them. So the most familiar is called the Wellhausen documentary theory. The Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, number 3, was formulated by Julius Wellhausen. This was the most commonly accepted position on the composition of the Pentateuch for the majority of the 20th century. So, when you look at commentaries written in the 1900s, whenever the 1900s is, could even be 1985, which most people would consider to be fairly recent, most of them still are either agreeing with this or are at least going through it in pretty heavy detail about who believes what and which passages belong to which redactor and how much of an influence did this editor have on this section of script, this section of Genesis versus this section, and it gets really, really difficult. Really difficult, really fast. So the end goal is to view the Pentateuch in light of its supposed original composite sources. So you've got 4 redactors, which we'll get into in a second, 4 redactors. Each one of them has a different reason for wanting to order Genesis in the way that they did. And the goal of the documentary hypothesis is to try to figure out which editor added which sections of Genesis why did they do it, and what was the history of it also, in order to better understand the book. Secondarily, the goal is to determine which sections are the result of which source. So there are 4 sources that the documentary hypothesis uses. The first one is the Yahwist source. So it's called J because these are Germans writing it, and Yahwist would be with a J, they don't have a Y. So the Yahwist source, summing up, like I said, like every scholar has a different viewpoint, but the Yahwist source generally is someone who is a Israelite and has the idea that Yahweh is the only God, and therefore when they edit Genesis, they're editing it according to a very Israelite and Yahweh-centered viewpoint. Versus the Elohist source. So sections generally where we see like Genesis 1, where God is only referred to as Elohim. The Elohist source is probably an earlier source, and this is all theory. The Elohist source would be an earlier source that maybe could be a polytheistic background, because Elohim is plural. So El would be the singular, Elohim would be plural, and so possibly Genesis had a polytheistic beginning to it, and then it was edited when Israel started to become more and more monotheist. Right? Now, so I don't believe this. Okay, I don't believe this. We're going through this because, like I said, this was the majority opinion in the 20th century. Okay? So the Elohist would usually be writing from a more an earlier standpoint and would have more of a polytheistic viewpoint on how things happen or whatever. The Deuteronomist is pretty much limited to the book of Deuteronomy, so this would be someone whose main standpoint is the second giving of the law, because that's what Deuteronomy means. Deutero means second. Namos means law. So the Deuteronomist is the Deuteronomy, the book, the second giving of the law.
When did you say that the book of Genesis was written?
We haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
So this answering the question though for this standpoint and where critics were coming from when they believed this was that there is no writing for the book of Genesis. It's been edited throughout its history. It was coming to its final viewpoint or final form in maybe 600 to 500 BC, somewhere in there, post-exile. And then so the last editor would be the priestly source. So the priestly source would be priests coming from a temple viewpoint. Their primary reason for re-editing the Old Testament or Genesis would be to add a priestly function to it. So, of course, there's problems with this. And for the most part, scholars, and especially conservative scholars, have moved away from this entirely in the last 20, 25 years. The biggest issue is just consensus. The scholars can't agree on any of this. So which passages belong to the J source? Well, some of them say one passage, some of them say a different one, some of them say the whole thing, some of them say none of Genesis, some of them say it's only limited to Genesis. You can't agree on anything. And so if they can't agree on anything, should we give this any credence whatsoever? And I don't think so. So they can't agree on which source is responsible for which passages. And that's supposed to say if, not is. If the Pentateuch is beautifully constructed. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm reading it wrong. That's correct. Is the Pentateuch beautifully constructed, or is it haphazardly glued together? Pretty much anyone that's a scholar on Genesis all talks about how well the whole thing is put together. Everything is very well constructed. All the points are all well thought out. There are minutiae in the wording or in the grammar and the way that the book is written that have every mark that whoever was writing it knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it and why they were writing everything. So if the consensus is that this is a bunch of redactors or editors that, you have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and they disagree with each other, how come the second redactor was stupid enough to just if Genesis 2 disagrees with Genesis 1, why didn't the person who plugged Genesis 2 in there change Genesis 1? Why did they just, if they disagree, why allow them to stand? Well, probably because they actually don't disagree with each other, and whoever wrote them just wrote them for different purposes. So
One
each
was an overview, wasn't it?
I think that
And the actual
Genesis.
count.
I think Genesis 1 has to do with God's. The focus is God's creation of the earth, and then Genesis 2 is God's creation of man. So it's the whole world, and then the garden and God's relation to man in the garden.
The world and the universe.
Yeah.
So in your mind, is it beautifully constructed, or
Yes.
is it haphazardly?
Haphazardly put
Yeah,
together?
yeah,
No,
right.
not at all. No. No.
It sounds
No,
like
we're
it's
thinking that
almost
all
like
scripture
glued
is
together
God-breathed,
because
it
there's
wasn't
many
together.
parts.
There are many parts, but the question
Right.
is there purpose in it being written that way? And if what the documentary hypothesis is ultimately saying is that this is just a bunch of different documents all glued together for no reason, then it can't be beautifully constructed.
Right.
But if you're saying that in the way it's written, it's beautifully, you can't do both at the same time. It's either beautifully constructed or it's haphazardly put together. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
And have the best of both.
Right. So the conclusion, the easiest way to deal with Genesis and the Pentateuch as a whole is to view it as a complete document, to view it as it stands in its present form. So Kenneth Matthews, in his commentary, we are satisfied that Genesis in its present final form is a cohesive unit that shows thoughtful order in a self-consistent theology. Essentially, there is one mind that has shaped the book, whom we believe have been Moses. So,
Which is tradition as well.
right. Which I don't think that there's any reason not to believe that Moses at least constructed it in its beginning form. However, there's caveats to that because those problems that we mentioned still remain problems. So there's, like I said, there's caveat to that. There's Mosaic authorship plus additions. So there's some stuff that's been added, but I'm happy with saying that this is Moses' work in its original form. There's reason why Moses would have written it in the first place. It's not just, here's some cool stuff that happened in the past. Like there is a reason why Moses wrote it to the people that he was writing to at that time, which would have been the people of the Exodus. It's not composite, but editorial. So it's not just Moses taking a bunch of documents he had at his disposal and just gluing them all together for no reason. He most likely wrote the whole thing from start to finish, but he most likely had sources. He was a man of his times, and he came from Egypt. He probably had a whole lot at his disposal, and we just don't know what it is because it's all been
There were
destroyed.
things that predated him.
Yeah.
Adam, who wrote it? Was it Adam or was it Seth? That recorded their lineage up till his
That's
time.
possible. Yeah.
You know, that didn't just come down to him. He had to be pulled from some source that he had,
Right.
which I definitely, believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I just always say, like, I don't know. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, it could be that under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he wrote what he thought made the most sense, and what came out was correct. He may have had a writing by Adam. It's possible. He may have had a writing by Seth. It's possible. I don't know because it doesn't exist. So I don't want to come down real hard and fast on anything. The only thing that I would not do is say, well, Moses got everything on Mount Sinai from God, because it doesn't say that. You know, Exodus doesn't say that, and I'm not going to ascribe something to God that the Bible doesn't say should be ascribed to him. So it's possible God could have given him all of the information and said, here's what happened in the past, but we're not told that, so I'm not going to take that jump. And I've gotten into little scuffles with people that have that position, and at the end of the day, it's like, okay, you want to say that because Jesus said that the Pentateuch are the books of Moses, that therefore Moses wrote absolutely everything that we find in them. And if I believe that Moses was more of an editor and that there were additions, you want to say that I don't believe in the Bible or I disagree with Jesus. But on the other hand, you're telling me that God gave Moses all of the information on Mount Sinai when the Bible doesn't tell me that. Who here is adding to Scripture? You know? So at the end of the day, like it's, you know, people don't want to hear it, but I am much happier saying, I don't know, rather than coming down hard and fast and concrete on something that.
You can speculate.
Yeah. I would much rather speculate and say, here's this option, here's this option, here's this option. I think this is a good one, but I don't know, you know. And on top of that, just the fifth option, which is that I'm just Mike. I'm a landscaper. I'm not a high scholar. I can read some pretty scholarly stuff sometimes, but I'm not. I'm a nobody, and I think that everybody needs to have that perspective to some degree, right? Okay, so getting back to what we were talking about, it's I believe that Moses basically authored it, but it's probably an addition. He's got sources in front of him that he's working with. He's got some kind of history that he's working with, but overall, he's writing it as he sees fit. It's not necessarily based on other texts, but at the very least, it's pointing to the same events as other texts. There's convergent memory involved. So we can look at things like the flood and look at Babylonian documents like the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Eridu Genesis, and like things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We can say, okay, we have a man who was pious and chosen by God, or whoever the God is in that document, to build a boat. And they went, and the entire area was flooded, and they were saved from the flood. And then at the end of the flood, they sent out a bird. And Genesis says this, and other books say this. So is Genesis dependent on the other books? Because we can definitely say that Genesis was written, if it was written by Moses, then it was written later than all of these other books, because like Epic of Gilgamesh is coming from like the earlier half of the second millennium BC. So really early. Things like and other books too, or other documents that we have are coming much earlier than Genesis. So we can't say that the Epic of Gilgamesh is based on Genesis, but should we say that Genesis is drawing from the Epic of Gilgamesh? Not necessarily, because there are so many differences between Genesis and all of these other pagan texts that you can't really say that there was any borrowing going on one way or the other. But does that mean that it's just all made up? No, they could all be talking about the same thing. It's really odd that both Atrahasis, which is a flood account, and Genesis both talk about the Noah figure releasing a bird. That's odd. because why would they both say the same thing? It makes the most sense to say, well, this actually happened. And we have multiple lines of memory coming through, and they're multiple people remembering the same historical occurrence, and they're writing about it. And one says that it was a raven, and one person says that it was a dove, and there's a difference
One of
there.
each.
What's that?
There was a couple doves and one raven.
Yes, but the Genesis only
No,
mentions
there was more than two of each animal.
the Genesis
And a bunch
only
of-
mentions
they had
the
clean animals for sacrifice as well.
Genesis only mentions the raven, and that was the one that was sent out that came back with the.
Figured it
With
had
the
meat
branch.
that was floating.
So what's that?
Figured it had meat that was floating. Didn't have anywhere to land though.
What is a
Redo Genesis. So next week we're going to go through all of these different books.
Over Genesis.
Yeah, right. Well, it's good to know what the other what did the surrounding societies to Israel believe.
Competition.
Yeah, competition, but also where were their similarities, where were their differences. It is good to know, to have some kind of a historical background, a cultural background. Anyway.
Different cultures have a flood account.
Mm-hmm.
Different flood accounts.
Oh, there's tons of them.
So it's convergent memory. They're all remembering the same event. They're just different
Locations in the books.
Perspectives.
different perspectives, or different what do I want to say? Different traditions. Because obviously the Greeks are going to have a very different tradition according to their gods, and then the Babylonians are going to have a very different tradition according to their gods. But they both remember a time when there were giants. It just looks different than how the Bible does,
What
but
was
they're all
Goliath?
a giant.
Okay.
Yeah. We can sum it up as Moses is the author, and the Israel of the Exodus is the primary audience. So, in terms of purpose, the primary purpose for Genesis is a polemic against false religion.
Okay, give us the definition of polemic. Oh,
Establishing truth while at the same time arguing against prevailing thoughts or beliefs without specific reference to beliefs, documents, religions, etc. So this kind of comes back to, like, does Genesis just wholesale borrow ideas from other false religions? No. But is it an argument against those false religions, talking about the exact same circumstances? Yes. Yes. So what would be the purpose of putting the flood story in Genesis? To show that this was not, the Eridu Genesis. Man became so populous that there were so many men on the earth now that they were getting noisy and they were bothering the gods, and therefore we need to get these people quiet, and so let's send a flood and get rid of them. Was that the reason? No. God saw that there was violence on the earth, and he said,
Evil
there was
planet.
there was violence on the earth, and my spirit shall not strive with man forever, and I'm going to send the flood, and I'm going to get rid of everyone. So different purpose altogether, which is that, and even in like the giving of the law, when you look at like the Code of Hammurabi, why was there a law? And a lot of obviously atheistic scholars will say, well, Moses' law was based on laws like Code of Hammurabi. Whereas if you actually look at it, Hammurabi is just saying, I set up these laws, and that shows how great of a king I am, versus what is the point of the law in the Bible? It's to say that God is holy and you should act like he does, right? So there's a morality to it that Babylon just didn't have. So Genesis in its polemic writing is it's making an argument against false religion without actually referencing the false religions per se. So Kenneth Matthews again, instead of borrowing or historicizing an ancient myth, it's fairer to say that Genesis comes closer to a repudiation of pagan ideas about origins, mankind, civilization, and the flood. So it's not just Moses looked at some, pagan polytheistic sources and then said, well, let's try to get rid of the polytheism and I'm just going to rewrite this in a monotheistic way. Or like, this sounds very mythological. I'm just going to try to remove some myth and then rewrite this. No, he just wrote his own book for his own purpose, which is telling Israel that the false gods are not real, and God's purpose in all of these things that you probably know as history, such as the flood and angels and the creation of the world. You know about all these things already, but what was the purpose of them? God had a very different purpose than, say, the Babylonians or the Assyrians would have. So it's a repudiation of pagan ideas, not just a Israelizing of everything. So secondary purpose, covenant faithfulness. This one gets missed in Genesis a lot. Covenant faithfulness. This one gets missed a lot. Which is that in Genesis, even though Genesis came before the giving of the law in terms of like its contents, God has not changed his mode of operation just because Israel now has a law. So Deuteronomy, we have a good explanation of what is the purpose of the law. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am commanding you today. And the curse, if you do not listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I am commanding you today by following other gods which you have not known. So sum that up. Bless me and I will bless you. Curse me and I will curse you. And what do we see in Genesis? Bless me and I will bless you. Curse me and I will curse you. And so we see that from Genesis all the way through the Pentateuch, and then the kind of conclusion summary to that is in Joshua, when Joshua has all of his campaigns, and then he basically tells Israel, look, the Lord has fulfilled his covenant with you. From this point forward, you guys can do what you want. As for me and my house, I will serve the Lord forever. Right? So Moses' purpose in writing Genesis would be, hey, you guys have this law, but there's not really a big change. Look at what happened before us. Things were the same back then. And Joshua is saying, hey, now you've actually seen it in your lives. So from this point forward, follow the law. Because the Lord is faithful to his covenant. Okay, so structure, which is Toledot. So how are we going to figure out a structure for the book of Genesis? Obviously, that whole redaction criticism thing doesn't work. So then how is it that we should look at Genesis? So the first form of structure that I would suggest would be Toledot. Toledot translates to these are the generations of. And we see that 12 times in the book of Genesis. Instead of trying, the upside to using this structure is that this is a structure that we find in the text, as opposed to trying to come up with our own means of drawing delineations with, between the chapters or whatever. So we've got 12 divisions in Genesis. Here's the ones in the section that we're studying in 1 through 12. So 1:1 to 2:3, 2:4 to 4:26, 5:1 to 6:8, 6:9 to 9:29, 10:1 to 11:9, 11:10 to 11:26, and 11:27, then through 25:11. So 11:27. Why does it start at 11:27? Because this is the generations of Abraham. So, I'm sorry, not these are the generations. No, Abraham. Yeah, Abraham.
What chapter?
11.
Oh, okay.
So this is that 11:27 through 25:11. This is going to be the story of Abraham. It starts with these are the generations of, and tells the entire story of Abraham. And then after that comes Isaac, and then after that comes Jacob. In chapter 2, verse 3, we see that these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And what did we read right before that? Well, the creation of the heavens and the earth. And so then when we get into chapter 2, we see what does the earth look like. So this Toledot structure, this is generally the one that people, that most conservative scholars look at Genesis from, and that's how they divide it up. And it's been suggested that maybe even each one of these had a different author, and Moses put them all together. So that's where, like Gary was saying, that's where the viewpoint that maybe Adam was an author. Well, maybe Adam wrote 1:1 through 2:3, and Moses had that as a document. It's possible. The thing is that we don't really know what the purpose of it is. Could be an introduction. Could be a colophon. A colophon is an ending. We see that in Babylonian documents where we have entire writing, and then at the very bottom it says, so-and-so wrote this for the purpose of this to this people, or something like that. So these are the generations of. It could be meant to be at the end of a section, not the beginning of a section. I think it's the beginning, but there are some people who have argued for the other side. So it's introducing a new section, maybe. Could be denoting a beginning and an end. So just talking about, here's an important person that had a bunch of sons, and we're going to land on the person that's important to the next section of the book.
Which is going to bring in Christ's lineage.
Yes, but in terms of the book itself, and what is the importance of them saying these are the generations of, most likely it's that here's our first person, this is our important person that we start with, and here's our last person, and this last person, so like Noah. It ends on Noah. Why? Well, because the whole next section is about Noah. That seems to make some sense. So there's another one, which is geography, so that's going to be 4B. It's geography, and we can divide Genesis up into chapters 1 through 11 are about Babylonia. Chapters 12 through 36 are about Canaan. And chapters 36 through 50 are about Egypt. And within this structure, we see that Canaan, or future Israel, it's central, and it's bracketed by its two most important neighbors. So this would be important to the Israelites because here's your world. These are the peoples that you're going to be amongst. And then there's a third way we could divide this, which is primeval, or before the flood, and then patriarchal. So the patriarchs of Israel. 1 through 11 are about people being expelled from a land. Right? So Adam and Eve were expelled from Egypt. Cain was expelled from wherever he was. Cain?
Egypt, no.
Or I'm sorry, did I say Egypt?
Yes, you did.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Cain was expelled from wherever. Noah was expelled from the pre-flood world. The people of Babel were expelled from Babylon. It's about people being moved out due to disobedience. Well, except in the case of Noah, but you get what I'm getting at there. And then 12 through 50 is people going towards a land. So Abraham goes from Ur of the Chaldees to the Promised Land. And then they go to Egypt. And then they're on their way from Egypt, once you get into Exodus, on their way from Egypt to the Promised Land again. So those are possibilities. Which one is the best? They've all got their upsides and downsides, and I think that if you're just looking at all of them as whole, and kind of sums up Genesis pretty well. Okay, so last bit. What about science in terms of the book of Genesis? Science and or scientific inquiry is definitely not the purpose of Genesis. So this isn't the first time I've taught through Genesis, and I have definitely had people that have gotten to this point and that I just don't see them in class anymore. And it's unfortunate, but Genesis is not about science, and I am not here to argue about evolution versus creationism or about partial flood versus global flood or whatever. It doesn't matter to me. What I care about is the Bible and what the Bible has to say. And there are places in the Bible where we have potential, and we can say, well, yeah, evolution can fit within the words of the Bible. A partial flood can fit within the words of the Bible. When we get into Genesis 6, it could be the godly line of Seth versus the ungodly line of Cain. Could be. I don't know. I disagree with certain things, but could be. And when it comes to science, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe, but I don't really care because that's not what the book was written about in the first place. So, the descriptions of creation are for the purpose of telling us who God is and what he has done. It's not there to tell us about, well, could it have been billions of years, and when did the dinosaurs show up, and how did the Grand Canyon get formed? This is not what Moses is thinking about whatsoever. He has no idea who this man is, who is Charles Darwin. No idea who he is, has no idea what the theory of evolution had anything to do with. And whether the Earth was millions of years old, or whether it was 6,000, or whether it was 120,000, it didn't make any difference to him whatsoever. What made a difference to him is that there is no God higher than our God. He is the creator of all that is, not just some of it, not something that pre-existed him and then he formed it. He is the creator of everything. That's Moses' point. And then the second point, which is that, therefore, all of the other gods out there, you are not to worship them because they are not like our God, right? That's the point of Genesis. The purpose of the biblical creation stories is not science. It is theological messaging. It's telling us something about God, something about our Creator, and in terms of Israel, telling us something about our covenant Lord, the one who is ours. The Lord has set us as Israel aside for his own portion, versus the nations have been given to other gods. So what about science, though? Science is largely unimportant to the author and the original audience, yet they don't care. They weren't at all concerned what animal was responsible for the evolution of the chicken, much less how many years it took for the earth to become fully formed. They were more concerned with who was responsible and in what way was he responsible.
Why do you think it changed from that theory to where we're at today?
Modern science.
Just
Yeah. It became more of, here it's now the late 1800s, and someone is proposing something that has never been proposed before, and it's being picked up as a majority opinion by people in academia. What should we say about it from a Christian standpoint?
I hear my kids all.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay.
Thank you for the class.
Yep, no problem. Yep. So then what do we as Christians say about this? What does the Bible say about this? Which then turns into our perspective on Genesis being one of a scientific nature. And it's not. I mean, I think that there are some things that are answered, but for the most part, it's just unconcerned with all of that. So my perspective on the science issue is that Darwinian evolution presents too many unanswered questions or problems, and we shouldn't even consider it as an issue to begin with in the first place. And if someone starts an issue or an argument with me about evolution, I'm just going to shrug my shoulders and say,
He didn't believe it at the
do you-
time of his death.
what's that?
He didn't believe it at the time of his death.
Well, even with that, it's like I don't care about Darwin, period. You know, what I care about is does God exist? Did he give us his word? And did he send us his son? So when it comes to, getting into an argument with an evolutionist, maybe. But when it comes to too many unanswered questions or problems, why assume that everything that is now just came from naturalistic means in the first place? Why assume that that the way that we've seen things ordered, that this is the only way that this could have come to being? And when it comes to problems,
The
baseline.
Bible makes more sense.
What's that?
The Bible makes more sense than that. In my
Well, in what way though? Like, what is the
It
Bible?
just- well,
That's really the question, is that the Bible doesn't tell us everything either. It doesn't tell us about did God make the duck-billed platypus, or was there an ancestor? There's possible there could be an ancestor to it, because we see ancestors to other animals. The question is what was the beginning point? What came off of the ark, or what was created by God in the beginning? We don't know. When it comes to evolution, evolution just takes too many things into possibility and considers all possibilities as being not, if it basically says that if there's a theoretical possibility, then it must be an actual possibility. When I look at, so when an evolutionist or Darwinian person looks at a whale and then looks at a cow and says, well, the pelvis is formed in a very similar way. Therefore, we could see how did I say elephant, whale? Whale and cow, yes. We could see how a whale could evolve into a cow based on the shape of the pelvis and the legs and so forth. Whereas I would say is, why presume that that's even a possibility in the first place? Just because I can imagine it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a possibility, right?
Yeah, that you see similarities in something that it has to be
Yeah.
related.
No, we can find similarities in anything. You can
Yeah.
you can go so far to find something in anything.
Yeah. And where we can, like Darwin's finches, and saying all the beaks are different and therefore they've got a
Evolve
common,
beak
and
and
yeah, we can demonstrate that. What we can't do is demonstrate that a chicken came from a Tyrannosaurus or that a cow came from a whale. We can't.
There's gaps and stuff in it, and people are just putting just stuff in them gaps that you don't even know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like,
There's just sorry, that's okay. But there's just a split though, that it's very clear that God did not evolve man from the animal.
For sure.
That there's clarity in.
For sure.
But besides that, then like what you're saying is there's a possibility of some of these things like
Yeah. Yeah.
in
That-
the end, does it really matter? Is it?
Yeah,
But
it
the
really
part about
doesn't
man
matter.
and the animal
Yeah.
does, I
Well,
would
yes,
think,
but no,
right?
but
the
the
rest,
whole, all the
the
other
rest
stuff,
of
in
it
the end, does it
could
really
be-
matter? Was
Mhm.
it a mallard or a goose that came off the ark? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
does that matter
Yeah.
in the end? It's Christ on the cross is what really ultimately matters.
Right.
well, and there's a creator.
But people just
Yeah,
like to
and
debate
I would even go so far as to say, like, and not only that, but to show that God has a people set out for Himself, and He will deliver those people, which in that case was Adam and his family, or I'm sorry, not Noah and his family, right? So anyway, going back to the original, on the whole, Darwinianism is at the least is problematic, or at least is problematic at best, impossible at worst. We just don't know whether it's actually possible or not. And the way I look at Darwinianism is that this was something that came up in the 1800s when there was no idea about genetics whatsoever, and we are still trying to figure out what is genetically possible, and we don't have answers to things. Therefore, it's just conceptual, and there's no consensus on anything. And as we start going farther along, there are more and more even atheistic scientists that are just saying this doesn't work. So when it comes to reading Genesis and looking at like arguments for or against evolution, I just don't care because I don't think that it's necessarily even possible. So anyway, going back to the science thing, like I'm really honestly not going to address it. It doesn't make much of a difference to me. I would much rather study the word as it exists and what its purpose is and what it's talking about. I'll bring in, if you're interested in looking at some of this stuff, like I'll bring in some more books as we go along that talk about these things and go into a little bit more depth. But on the whole, like I'm not interested in science, and wait till we get to Genesis chapter 6, because there are books written in like the 2nd century BC that it's like angel plus man equals big man. Angel plus animal, big animal? Question. So that just makes things even more convoluted when it comes to the science stuff. So
I like that.
yeah. So, okay, we're going to end there. Lord, we just thank you for this day, and just thank you that we could study your word together, and just pray that you'll be with Pastor Frank as he preaches, and pray that you'll be with the congregation, and in your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Hey, thank you.
All right.